All right. This is the American YAWP, Chapter 10, Religion and Reform. So, this chapter focuses primarily on some of the reactions to a lot of the changes that have been taking place in American society, kind of in this antebellum or pre Civil War period. And to just kind of touch upon some of these things, they include industrialization, improvements in technology, immigration, and the expansion of democracy. And while all of these things brought benefits, they also created a kind of new set of problems. We might say that change introduced new problems, and Americans wanted to fix them. And that essentially is what a lot of the kind of reform aspect in this chapter is. How to make society better given these new problems. Um, a lot of these reform movements are also connected with religion. In fact, one kind of connection that we might be able to kind of measure here is that when there was a lot of significant change, it really kind of causes people to go back to institutions of stability. And oftentimes that is typically something like church or religion. So, kind of the more that society is changing around one person, the more kind of chaotic that society may be feeling, it kind of has the impact or effect of kind of making people look for pillars of stability. And church and religion certainly is that. So, we see an uptick in religious participation. So, kind of what is at the background of a lot of these reform movements in the pre Civil War period. And maybe we'll just define this term here because it's helpful. Antebellum. That's exactly spelled correctly. But the antebellum period is just before the Civil War. So when we say the antebellum North or the antebellum South, we're mostly just referring to the United States prior to the Civil War. So sometimes this chapter is also called antebellum reform, depending on what sort of text one is using. So, what is kind of going on in the background of all of these sort of reform movements to try to make society better? Well, it's a massive religious revival, sometimes referred to as the Second Great Awakening. Recall that there was a first Great Awakening prior to the American Revolution. This Second Great Awakening comes really in the aftermath of changes brought about by like things like industrialization. So, a Great Awakening is simply just we might call it an increase in church attendance and participation. It's when religion spread across the United States, more people going to church. The Second Great Awakening had things that were in common with the First Great Awakening. So, things like emotion being stressed, also kind of a more open tent, we might say, for more people to participate. We might say about the Second Great Awakening, or to say more diverse participants. Great awakenings are really about kind of bringing everyone into the fold of religion. But there was one kind of feature of the Second Great Awakening that was maybe unique to this period, and it kind of fits in very well with what is going on historically, and that is this idea of human action leading to salvation. And essentially, one of the main messages of the Second Great Awakening. So we'll say a main message of the Second Great Awakening. And it preached that one's own action and lead to salvation. Right? This was kind of like individual action salvation. So the idea was that, kind of no matter how badly you may have sinned in the past, the message was you still have control over your own destiny, or you have control over your own salvation. You get to decide through your own moral actions whether or not you go to heaven or whether or not you go to hell. And again, this fit kind of very nicely with some of the other historical trends that were going on at the time. Think back to Jacksonian democracy. Jacksonian democracy, there was an emphasis on the individual. And if we look at things like industrialization, just realization, industrialization was very much a loss of control for a lot of people. And so this message of saying, hey, look, you may have lost control in your job or in your economic life, but don't worry. I'm going to tell you a message where, regardless of how much control you may have lost economically, you still have control over your own fate, right? Whether or not you go to heaven and hell. So, this message of human action and individual salvation, again, aligned very nicely with kind of other cultural trends of celebrating individualism, and also was a very attractive response to what was happening economically in the United States. This notion of more diverse participants, there's a better term here, spiritual egalitarianism. And this is kind of a notion, we might say, of spiritual equality. And much like the first Great Awakening, it allowed for, we might say, uneducated church leaders, right? Kind of the barriers to be a preacher or the barriers to kind of speak with authority on religion, those things were lowered as a result of the Second Great Awakening. And so more people can kind of be brought in with this. And again, kind of this notion of spiritual egalitarianism, Jacksonian democracy, American Revolution, individualism more broadly. These things kind of all overlap with each other. Now, as far as the religious responses to the changes going on in American society, like we mentioned earlier, these are all the changes that we're referring to, right? Um, there were other religious responses. Not all celebrated this kind of individualistic, emotional version of Christianity. Some actually thought to kind of create more structure and order in society. And a perfect example of that is the founding and the emergence of Mormonism. So Mormonism was a religion that was founded in this period. And what it stressed more than anything else was kind of two things. One was structure and order. You know, um, things had become rather chaotic in the antebellum period, not just with like new technologies like trains and telegraphs and all those other things, but with a lot of immigration, demographics were changing significantly. The economy was changing significantly from the Industrial Revolution and the Market Revolution, and so what the Mormons really sought to do was to kind of create a religious system that was much more structured, much more orderly, to try to kind of rein in the chaos. Um, and another thing that the Mormons stressed was the connection. Oops, connection. Mm, a little easily. Was a connection between church and state. And this harkened back to something that happened earlier, and that was, from the American Revolution, there was a strong emphasis, equals, strong emphasis on the separation of church and state. A lot of the Enlightenment ideas and a lot of the Enlightenment principles really stressed this notion or these notions of religious equality and religious toleration, separation of church and state. And in fact, after the American Revolution, pretty much every single state government got rid of their official religions, right? They became very secular. The US Constitution is a secular document. Some people in American society, kind of seeing where this experience had gotten them, or this experiment had gotten them, said, look, that was a mistake, right? We should have never disconnected church and state. Look where it got us. It got us overcrowding and disease and crime, and that was a mistake. We need to make the connection between church and state once again. And so that's kind of what the Mormons were offering. The founder of the Mormon religion was Joseph Smith. He was the founder of the religion. And the Mormons faced oftentimes persecution. One could be because they, preached a, different version of Christianity. So, other Christians did not take, that very well. And also many rumors about the Mormons and the practice of polygamy, which is the practice of having more than one wife. Some of the leaders of the Mormon church did practice polygamy, but that was often kind of like a scandalous way of slandering the Mormons in the newspaper. And eventually, kind of this persecution led the Mormons to move from area to area to area to area, to eventually to the point where its leader, Joseph Smith, was murdered by a mob. And after the murder of the founder of the Mormon religion, Joseph Smith, the Mormons decided they would move out of American society, more or less to pretty much about as isolated as one could get, and that was Salt Lake City, Utah. Relocated here, Salt Lake City, Utah, where they could thrive independently, away from harassment, away from the United States government. And even today, there's a very kind of strong and high Mormon presence in Utah, going all the way back to the 1840s. As far as Mormonism goes, probably one of the things that is the most unique about Mormonism is that Mormonism is typically described as a uniquely American religion. You can pretty much trace back a lot of different kind of versions or sects of Protestant Christianity to Europe, but Mormonism is kind of a purely American one in sort of that sense. So, yes, a lot of the religious responses to the Great Awakening were to kind of emphasize these aspects of Christianity, but it's also worth noting that not everyone had the same reaction. What we definitely can say, though, was that religion was on the rise, right? Religion was on the rise. Now, other responses to kind of these changes happening included things outside the realm of religion, more so in the realm of like intellectualism and philosophy. And one of the more important movements was that of transcendentalism. And transcendentalism was we might just call it an intellectual movement. Doesn't really have a lot of followers. They remain relatively small in number, so this is not like sweeping across the country like these other religious movements are. And it was an intellectual movement that, we'll say that stressed. Again, some of these themes are going to be familiar. Individualism. And also nature, though. One of the things that a lot of people kind of suspected, given the industrial changes in society, is that, with kind of the growth of factories and cities and, everything else, people had kind of lost touch with nature because of industrialization, and because societies had become so complex, people had kind of lost their individual identity. So this connection with individualism, this connection with nature, these are the kind of the things that the transcendentalists said that were important. They talked about, to a certain degree, like spirituality, right? In not so much of a logical sense, right? A lot of the Industrial Revolution and Enlightenment. If we go back up to the American Revolution was sort of steeped in Enlightenment thought, logic, reason. The Transcendentalists were, kind of a little bit different, right? Wanting to reconnect with nature and everything else. Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau are the most famous transcendentalists. So we just might say about these two individuals. Where do I want to write this? Most famous transcendentalists, along with Thoreau. Emerson's probably most famous work was called Self-Reliance. Thoreau is most known for, or amongst the things that he is most known for, is his book Walden, where he attempted to reconnect with nature by living on the side of a lake, kind of getting out of industrial society. But Thoreau is also known for his ideas as they pertain to civil disobedience. And civil disobedience means to break immoral laws. And, kind of the problem for Thoreau and, a lot of other transcendentalist thinkers and writers is, they had believed that society had become so corrupt and so immoral, but also that society had become like so overwhelmingly influential and powerful. So as just like one small little cog in the machine, how do you fight back against this kind of behemoth of immorality and sin? And Thoreau kind of made a very simple point, and that was practice civil disobedience, break immoral laws, and he also stressed, peacefully. That if there is something immoral, just as an individual person, don't do it. And you might be surprised by the outcome. So transcendentalism also was a response in the antebellum period. Again, a smaller kind of scale in terms of the movement, a lot more intellectual, not a lot of people involved in it, but some of the ideas that come from the transcendentalists do have a pretty big impact later on in history, right? Civil disobedience, especially. Now, as far as reform movements go, in section 3, there's kind of an additional point that your textbook wants to make, and that is essentially that reform movements, or this way, say that because it's not just England, but it's also Europe. We'll just say, we'll say Europe, because Europe industrialized before the U.S. Say many reforms started there first. And so, as a consequence of that, this sort of section here, Atlantic origins of reforms, just kind of wants to make that point that a lot of the reform movements that end up emerging in the United States had some of their origins in Europe before. And because of new technologies, the connection between Europe and the United States is closer than ever. So transportation, things like steamships and, industrial printing, right, literature, say that these are new technologies that connect European reforms with the United States. And a good example of this, or some of the reform movements that are mentioned, are Christian missionaries, right, Protestant Christian mostly. and those that were working in the abolitionist movement. The abolitionist movement is to abolish slavery. Section 4, the Benevolent Empire. So the Benevolent Empire refers to the combination, we'll call it the combination of Protestant Christianity and reform. A lot of the reform movements have kind of this backing of Protestant with them. Many reformers themselves are Protestant, and we see a very close connection between religion and reform. During the antebellum period, when all of these changes were taking place, a very kind of popular, maybe sermon or kind of religious narrative coming from Protestant communities was the Jeremiad. And the Jeremiad is sort of a story about, either moral or social decline, right? So sort of these, the idea that everything is kind of becoming worse or getting worse, and that if one does not act or do anything about it, society is going to devolve into, sin and chaos. And, it's sort of this sense of impending doom, maybe, right? Unless one takes action. So when it comes to the various reform movements, this is not true exclusively, but this is true of the majority, is that many of them are coming from this middle class Protestant background, right? We might just say a majority of reformers come from this background. Now, it's not the very rich, not the very, very poor, not so much a lot of the immigrant population. It's kind of this middle class Protestant. And one of the reasons as to why it could be this class was, because in some sense, we might say that middle class wealth, maybe, provided time and resources for reform. If you're amongst the working class, probably don't have a lot of time to dedicate to reform movements. Maybe kind of, well, we'll kind of leave that off for later. But yeah, if you're middle class, you have more time and more resources to go out and engage in reform movements because you're not having to work every single hour of the day, and so there's a certain kind of class element maybe to this. One thing that is also true is that despite the fact that Protestants came in many denominations, a lot of Protestants could kind of unify behind all of these principles. We might just say that the many denominations, many denominations of Protestants, I will say, agreed on these principles. So there wasn't any sort of barrier in most cases for different Protestant denominations to work together on many of these reforms. And what type of reforms are we actually talking about here? Well, reforms can come in kind of all different shapes and sizes. Just to give you an example, and it's not limited to only these forms, but to give you a couple of examples of various reforms, temperance is one. We'll talk about this one a little bit in more detail. Temperance refers to getting rid of alcohol. Another one was various moral reforms, especially with kind of this Protestant Christianity background. A lot of reformers suggested that the solution to society's problems was for people just to act more moral. This might be things like crusades against prostitution, gambling, maybe stuff like that. Other reforms could be with prisons, or we might call this, well, right, or slash criminal justice. Crime was on the rise, and so the idea was maybe we need to kind of rethink our criminal justice system in order to cut back on crime. And so you see an image here of a state penitentiary, 1855, that was part of a broader prison reform that was going on in the United States. And lastly, education, and specifically kind of sympathy or support for public education. And public education could do multiple things. It could keep kids off the street. It could keep kids out of the factories. It could assimilate immigrants. This is kind of one of the often overlooked things about public schooling, but how do you take someone like an Italian immigrant and turn him into an American? Well, you put him through the public schooling system, and that could be a solution for immigration. So it's not to say that there weren't other reforms, but a lot of the reforms, or these are kind of good examples of what Americans were looking to change. We'll go ahead and mention a couple in particular here, just to get sort of a sense for how they operate. Temperance, like we mentioned before, this is a reform to prohibit. It's also sometimes called prohibition, to prohibit alcohol. To prevent its selling, its manufacturing, to prevent its transport. And, for reformers, in their eyes, if you could just get rid of alcohol, that might alleviate a lot of the problems. And so temperance was kind of a major part of this. What sort of, um, there's kind of an interesting point about alcohol that your textbook mentions here, and we'll just kind of include it here to give you an idea of just why temperance became such an important issue. One of the reasons why it became such an important issue. Your textbook says that whiskey was cheaper than milk and beer and safer than water. All right, so this quote is kind of touching upon some of the kind of features of antebellum industrial society. The idea of whiskey being cheaper. Well, a lot of this you can contribute to the market revolution. This kind of efficiency of production, right? Farmers being able to distill whiskey and then put it on the trains and then transport it, and only like the really efficient whiskey makers getting their product to market. And then this point about safer than water, this has to do with urbanization and disease. A lot of these industrial cities were hotbeds of disease, cholera outbreaks. And so if if for anything but just the pure economics of it, and for the pure medical reasons, one would choose whiskey as their preferred beverage over everything else, right? Maybe you don't even care for alcohol that much, but because it was cheaper and because it was safer, more people drank it. You also have the problem, for example, of uh, just the fact that drunkenness becomes a bigger problem when more people are living closer together, right? So it's not so much. I mean, part of it is that alcohol consumption increased, but it's not only that. One other point that we have to make about temperance, or we should make between temperance, is that there is a connection between temperance and anti-immigrant sentiments. A lot of these Protestant reformers, and this is not entirely accurate, but a lot of these Protestant reformers end up blaming the increase in alcohol. What am I doing here? End up increasing the blame of alcohol consumption on arriving immigrants. And the truth is that we don't really see that big of a discrepancy in terms of drinking, but it kind of became a convenient overlap for a lot of reformers who opposed both alcohol and opposed immigration. Organizations that really advocated on behalf of temperance included organizations like the American Temperance Society. This was founded in the 1800s. I want to say, was it 1826? Maybe I'm getting that wrong. But the things that the American Temperance Society did included things like produce literature. I have a couple of examples here. give speeches, pass laws, right? So these are all different ways that organizations or reform movements work. So we have a couple of temperance cartoons here. This one is called the Tree of Temperance. And again, don't know how well one can look at that, but this is a tree of alcohol consumption. Tree does not look so healthy. And this is the Tree of Temperance. Health looks like a very nice tree. This one's called the Drunkard's Progress, probably one of the more recognizable temperance kind of posters. It's showing you the progress of a drunkard from, one drink to two drinks to three drinks, all the way up to this point up here where, things are looking pretty good, right? This guy's having a good old time. But then the downward spiral of homelessness and eventual suicide and the impact that it had on families. And especially for something like the temperance movement, the impact on families, the impact on women, that was a thing that was emphasized by reformers. And, this is a point that we've made, or this is a point that we can make if we haven't made it already, is that a lot of times in reform movements, or this is a point that we will make here, is that a lot of women participated in reform movements disproportionately because this is a time where women don't have the vote. And so if there's an issue in public, it's not as if women can just go out and vote for somebody that might take care of it. They need to take a role in various reform movements. So a lot of times things like temperance were, the type of literature and speeches focused that on the impact that it had on families, that it had on wives, that it had on children, and this is a perfect example of that. Another reform movement that we can point to that kind of gives us a stronger sense of the role that Protestant Christianity played is the American Bible Society and the American Tract Society. These were two organizations that sought to bring Christianity pretty much to anyone, to be quite honest. I mean, some of the groups that the American Bible Society or American Tract Society would do, they typically print out a bunch of Bibles and then send them everywhere. Included urban cities. So they might go into urban areas, maybe even looking specifically for immigrant populations, Native Americans. In fact, some Bibles were translated into Native American languages, and places, even like Asia and Africa. We might say sought to bring Christianity. Anyone, we'll just say printed Bibles to essentially hand out. And the idea was that, well, if more people kind of converted to Christianity, then the idea was that inspired by this new morality, society would become better, right? That was sort of the idea. However, there could be some conflicts in these reform movements, and your textbook provides one example here, and this is the policy of Indian removal, which we haven't yet gone over in detail. I believe it's covered in, is it the next chapter, chapter 11 or chapter 12? But it's not covered in the chapter on Andrew Jackson, which is mostly kind of the chapter that is associated with this, but we'll talk more about Indian removal here in the future. But anyways, the policy of Indian removal conflicted with the goals of Protestant missionaries. Essentially, this applied to groups in the Southwest, specifically the the Cherokee, which, because of Protestant missionaries and the arrival of a written language and all these other things, the tribes of the Southeast were sometimes referred to as the quote unquote civilized tribes. And civilized was kind of a term used to describe, we might say, assimilated, Native American tribes or communities Native Americans. And if you're a Protestant missionary, right, looking to convert, and in fact did convert many Cherokee, when the United States Congress opted to pursue a policy of removal rather than a policy of assimilation, that was a big conflict or big issue for a lot of these reformers. All right, moving on to section 5, anti-slavery and abolitionism. And as far as the various reform movements go, the abolitionist movement becomes the most important one, certainly in the short term, but maybe arguably also in the long term. And you'll notice that this section has two different titles, anti-slavery and abolitionism. And what that is sort of referring to is the fact that these aren't necessarily the same. And we'll talk about kind of what the difference between anti-slavery and abolitionism ends up being. But as far as slavery goes, we had started this chapter by saying that the antebellum period brought new problems to society. But the question that we can ask is slavery new? And in fact, rewrite this. Is slavery new? And the immediate answer to that is no. In fact, slavery is about as old as an institution as one can find. But keep in mind, what is new is, or what is becoming new, is the rapid, we might say, what is new is the rapid growth, spread, and profitability of slavery. This is something that is covered in the next chapter, chapter 11. And even though slavery itself as an institution isn't new in the United States, it's been around ever since 1619 when the first African slaves were brought to the English colony of Jamestown. What is new is that starting around the 1820s or 1830s, there's a crop that becomes so valuable, it's sometimes referred to as white gold. And when the United States, or specifically when the Southern economy transforms itself into a cotton economy, the consequences of that is that slavery begins to grow very rapidly. It spreads throughout the entire country, and it is sort of has this newfound profitability that now makes slavery seem like an even bigger threat than it was before. And so, in some sense, even though slavery isn't new, we could definitely say that the problem of slavery is new because now it's growing, it's expanding, it's more profitable. And if nobody does anything about it, if the abolitionists don't do anything about it, then what's going to kind of keep it in check. So, as far as the voices and organizations and opinions that oppose slavery, they came in many different shapes and forms. We're first going to begin with the anti-slavery voices. That is, organizations or groups or even religious groups that oppose slavery, but we wouldn't go so far as to call them abolitionists yet. Abolitionism is going to have a kind of a more specific definition in terms of how slavery ought to be gotten rid of. One of the most popular anti-slavery organizations was the colonizationist movement. We might say that the colonization movement was, we might say, popular among maybe like more mainstream, white politicians. And what the colonization movement suggested was getting rid of slavery But the follow-up question or the follow-up procedure is then to colonize African Americans, those freed but also free blacks, African Americans, to Africa. In fact, the colony that was created by one of these colonization societies was the colony of Liberia. And Liberia was designed or set up to be a colony that former American slaves could move to. So the colonization movement, yes, they wanted to get rid of slavery, but they did not envision a United States that was racially integrated. They wanted to preserve the United States as a white demographic. And so after the abolition of slavery, the plan was then to colonize African Americans to Liberia, right, to move them out of the United States. So groups or organizations like the Colonization Society, we would not consider them to be abolitionists, right? We consider them to be anti-slavery. Another group that we wouldn't maybe necessarily consider abolitionists, but are certainly closer to it, are the Quakers. And the only reason why we're not going to kind of say the Quakers are the abolitionist movement is because the Quakers are a religious group, first and foremost. The Quakers are, we might say, hold anti-slavery views. I mean, even I'll go so farther than that. They hold abolitionist views. Because of their religious convictions. If you're not familiar or if you forgot, the Quakers are a religious group in the United States. And in fact, they are some of the kind of earliest anti-slavery voices going all the way back to the colonial era, even before the United States declared its independence. And, yeah, the Quakers have more abolitionist views, but, are the Quakers abolitionists? Certainly some Quakers are abolitionists, but we want to think of the Quakers more as a religious group, right? Or not just a religious group, but a religion. And the abolitionists are more of a reform movement, right? So it's not exactly the same thing, although they do hold kind of very, very similar views. And then there are others like David Walker, who we might not, abolitionists and anti-slavery get, the terms get used pretty, they get used pretty interchangeably. And so it's not the biggest deal to kind of confuse them. But the point is that one could have views against slavery, but not technically be part of this reform movement known as the abolitionist movement, and David Walker might be one of them. David Walker was a free African American who saw colonization as racist. So he did not agree with this notion of simply just forcing African Americans out of, not just having slavery be abolished, but then force them to a different country. He didn't see that as correct. He said, quote, David Walker said that African Americans had possessed the hard-won rights to liberty. In other words, enslaved Africans and free African Americans ought to be able to enjoy what every other American enjoyed. And one thing to keep in mind, and this is especially true by the time we start getting a lot closer to the Civil War, is that most enslaved Africans in the United States by this time were born in the United States. They weren't directly from Africa. So the idea of going to Africa was essentially being shipped off to a completely different country, right? The United States had more or less kind of become home, and David Walker certainly kind of agreed with that yes, slavery is evil and it should be abolished, but those people ought to enjoy the hard-won rights of liberty. One thing that might make David Walker outside the purview of the specific abolitionist movement is that David Walker was also someone who advocated or proposed that slaves rise up and kill their masters. And so he was much more kind of fiery and confrontational in his rhetoric. Broadly speaking, the abolitionists are kind of looking for a peaceful solution to this. So, as far as abolitionists go, let's go ahead and define specifically what an abolitionist believes, right? So, it's not just, opposition to slavery. That is certainly one part of it. But to be an abolitionist, you have to call for immediate emancipation, right? So any type of gradual plan to get rid of slavery, that's not good enough for the abolitionists. So, for example, organizations like the colonization movement, they were much more gradual. In fact, a lot of state laws were gradual, right? Remember that a lot of states in the North got rid of slavery, but got rid of it gradually. The abolitionists said no, right? We need immediate emancipation and, kind of like what David Walker said, citizenship, right? They agreed with Walker when he said that, people should enjoy the hard-won rights of liberty. So it wasn't only about the opposition to slavery, but it was an extension of rights and citizenship. That made someone an abolitionist, right? You needed to believe this. The second thing that we can maybe differentiate the abolitionists or the abolitionist movement, again, the terminology can kind of get a little bit confusing, but abolitionist movement will kind of better define it or more clearly define it. The abolitionist movement from others like Walker, maybe others approaching a more militant approach, is the strategy that abolitionists believed, and that was what they call moral suasion. And moral suasion is the strategy of convincing, right, or like argument enslavers of the immorality and un-Americanness of slavery. Right. And we would say, in some sense, this is kind of like a nonviolent approach, right? The abolitionists as a reform movement before the Civil War were not engaging in violence, although there were some who did, right? We're not there yet, but people like John Brown, for example. But this is also kind of important in understanding where the abolitionists are come from. So again, to be an abolitionist, not only do you have to oppose slavery, that's like step one, you also have to oppose it and then advocate for the extension of citizenship and rights, not just to former slaves, but to all free blacks in the United States. And you must also follow a policy of essentially kind of like a nonviolent persuasion-esque type of policy. And, the reason how and why the abolitionists came to that conclusion is because of kind of the ways they argue against slavery. So this quote here from William Lloyd Garrison, who, William Lloyd Garrison, we'll just make a note about him here. He is probably one of the most famous abolitionists. Certainly one of the most recognizable. And he kind of outlines the basis for which the abolitionist belief system is formed. He says, immediate emancipation based off of the Declaration of Independence and upon the truths of divine retribution. And this kind of gets down to these 2 points here. And that is to say that according to the abolitionists, slavery is un-American, right? If all of the rhetoric of the American Revolution is true, then that means that not only should you be opposed to slavery, but you should also endorse the extension of rights and citizenship, right? If all men are created equal and that actually means what you say it means, then you come to this logical conclusion, right? You have no other choice. And the other idea about slavery being a sin forces you to endorse immediate emancipation, right? If slavery is wrong, it doesn't make any sense to kind of gradually stop doing wrong things, right? You wouldn't apply this to other sins like murder and theft, right? It wouldn't be appropriate to say, look, I'm just going to gradually stop murdering people, right? If it's a sin, it's a sin, and you need to advocate for immediate emancipation, right? It's either right or it's wrong. So these are generally understood to be kind of the two pillars for which the abolitionist movement is founded on, right? The sort of religious element and the element related to American rhetoric. So these were mostly like moral arguments, right? It wasn't an economic argument against slavery. It wasn't a political argument. It was, it was moral arguments and it was idealistic arguments. Garrison, one of the most famous abolitionists at a time, he certainly had a gift, you might say, for attracting controversy. We might just say about him, he attracted controversy. So for example, he would oftentimes burn copies of the Constitution out in public, and that would get a lot of people mad, and so they might see his name in the newspaper. The Liberator, this was Garrison's abolitionist newspaper. And as far as spreading the word about the evils of slavery, the abolitionists had a more challenging job than a lot of other reformers, and that was especially to convince other Northerners. The abolitionist movement is a movement that is more or less relegated to the North. To convince other Northerners of the evils of slavery, it was harder because slavery wasn't present in the North, right? So a lot of Northerners, for a lot of Northerners, slavery was out of sight, out of mind. And so what the abolitionists had to do was to convince Northerners that it was a problem, right? And that was harder to do if it didn't affect their day-to-day life. So the abolitionists did all of the same things that other reform movements did, like the temperance movement, create literature, give speeches, kind of hand out information. Specifically, we can kind of point to some things. The abolitionists made effective use of the postal service. Oftentimes sending mailers, specifically to slaveholders in the South, trying to convince them of the evils of the institution, and also to petition Congress. At this time, there are not really a lot of members of Congress that are willing to kind of speak out on the issue of the abolition of slavery, but it's getting there, right, as time goes on. And so to petition a member of Congress and have them kind of, discuss it out in the open was a way of bringing more attention to it. So these were kind of two strategies that the abolitionists used. Now, the abolitionists did face some pushback in, variety forms. One good example of this is the fate of Elijah Lovejoy. He was an abolitionist who died, or maybe more appropriately, was killed. Killed, we'll say, by a mob. By a mob while defending his abolitionist printing press. And one of the reasons why the abolitionists were targeted was not just kind of their stance on slavery and their kind of radical notion of social equality, but also because the abolitionists were bringing up a subject that was very dangerous for the country. As we get closer and closer to the American Civil War, the more that one would talk about an issue like slavery, the more that the country divided. And so, in some sense, if the abolitionists could just shut up about it, that might, in the short term, keep the country from breaking apart. So, by speaking about the issue of slavery so openly and so publicly, in some sense, they were threatening the dissolution of the country. So, the desire to kind of shut them up was very strong, not just in opposition to kind of their ideas about racial equality, but specifically in opposition to the political risk that the abolitionists were running. And a perfect example of this is what the United States Congress did. So one of the strategies that the abolitionists did was to petition Congress. The abolitionists petitioned Congress so much that eventually Congress passed what was known as the gag rule. And this was a law that banned all discussion of the abolition of slavery in Congress, more specifically in the House of Representatives. So eventually, Congress just said, "Look, we're not going to talk about it anymore." And the issue of slavery is especially in the years leading up to the Civil War, politicians are highly incentivized to not talk about it, and even go so far as to pass laws simply to not mention it at all. Now, some abolitionists didn't think that the strategy of moral suasion was good enough, that you can't simply just convince people to do it, and maybe that the abolitionists need to take a more direct approach. And so, starting in the 1830s, abolitionists formed their own political party. The Liberty Party was a political party formed for the purpose of abolishing slavery. Of abolishing. Now, the Liberty Party didn't do too well, I would say, in terms of national politics, but it will be the start of a series of well, the Liberty Party begins as a abolitionist party, and essentially what happens as time goes by is they end up joining in with other anti-slavery parties, right? That are people who don't exactly agree on everything, like the full extent of citizenship and rights, but it makes more political sense to kind of build your party with a broader anti-slavery message. Eventually, the Liberty Party rolls into the later Free Soil Party, which rolls into the later Republican Party, which is responsible for getting Abraham Lincoln elected. But for the time being, the Liberty Party is relatively small. Now, of all of the abolitionists in the United States, perhaps the most recognizable one is Frederick Douglass. So, along with Garrison, Douglass is one of the most famous abolitionists. Douglass was different than Garrison because Douglass could speak about slavery personally. Douglass had escaped slavery and became an abolitionist. And in terms of one of the most powerful tools that abolitionists had was the ability to tell the story of slavery from a personal account. One thing to emphasize about the abolitionists is that they really emphasized on emotion and kind of the human quality or human aspect to it. So the fact that Frederick Douglass could could go up in front of crowds in the North and say, "Look, I'm not only telling you about the evils of slavery, I'm telling you about what personally happened to me." That was, in some sense, the most effective way of changing people's minds. All right, last section, section 6, women's rights in antebellum America. So, one of the major consequences of these various reform movements in the pre Civil War period is the emergence of the women's rights movement. And we can think about the women's rights movement as being, in some ways, kind of an outgrowth of earlier reform movements. So, there were a couple of things that contributed to the quote unquote rise of the public woman. And the public woman was a term that was sometimes used to describe the women that were involved in kind of improving broader society, right? So this is maybe a term used for, say, advocates of reform. And there were a couple of things that were responsible for the rise of the public woman or women becoming more involved in, in reform movements. One was something we talked about earlier, the Second Great Awakening. And the Second Great Awakening, like we mentioned, did allow for a more diverse demographic to participate religiously. This included a lot of men and women. So women became more active within their churches, sort of in a more public way. A second thing is educational opportunities. Educational opportunities increased. More women were going to school and playing a role in that. And you had a lot of kind of advocates, women's rights advocates, who advocated for equal access to education for both men and women. So as more women became involved in churches, as more educational opportunities increased, the ability for women to affect society in a reform kind of mindset increased. A couple of things, and these are just kind of worth mentioning. These are things that maybe didn't change maybe as much, but we can tie this to the broader reform movements and just say, look, this is not just true for women, but society is changing, right? So we can see the rise of women advocating reform in society as being just part of a larger reform movement more broadly, right? And this wouldn't be specifically unique to women at the time. Another one is the issue of suffrage, and that we mentioned before, but unlike men, women at this time do not have the right to vote, but it's really out of these reform movements that the demand for the right to vote emerges. So if you were a minded woman in the antebellum era, you had no political outlet. And so that kind of forced you into a more kind of reform. It forced you into activities that were related more to reform movement. So maybe we can kind of say all of these things attributed to greater participation in reform movements by women at this time. Now, in order to be engaged in reform, oftentimes it meant kind of breaking what was considered the stereotypes of the day. And both of these terms, the cult of domesticity and the cult of womanhood, both of these are descriptions of the prevailing gender stereotypes. And gender, remember, it refers to the role that men and women play in society. So the cult of domesticity, cult of womanhood, descriptions of the prevailing gender stereotypes. We'll just go ahead and leave it at that. And essentially what kind of both of these ideas advanced was the idea that for women, these sort of characteristics or behaviors or the expectations of what was considered appropriate were things related to like, piousness, purity, domesticity. That is a close association with the home, not so much with the public life. And we might also include things like submissive. For men, it was different, right? For men, men were expected to be out in the sort of public realm. Not so much that men were expected to be like not pious, but certainly they were not the keepers of morality, right? We might say. And so this led to a very kind of distinct divide between the public and the private. So again, we could associate men with oops, I almost got those things mixed up there. Men with the public and women with the private. And so in some sense, for women to be advocating for reforms out in the public, that was challenging the prevailing gendered stereotypes of the day. However, though, the cult of domesticity and the cult of womanhood, while it discouraged women from playing an active role in the public area, it could also be used to kind of support women in their role in social reforms. And this is kind of how the argument went. It said that women as the quote unquote guardians of, we'll say, morality, should help maybe battle the immorality in public society. In other words, the argument was, well, who better to fight corruption? Who better to fight immorality? Who better to fight sin than women, if they are the the supposed keepers of morality? And so, these ideas related to domesticity and womanhood, they could actually be used by reformists to kind of boost their position in some of these reforms. And again, some of these reforms, we talked about some of them earlier, but they're worth mentioning again. Things like labor laws, things like prison reform. We talked about temperance earlier, abolitionist movement. I mean, all of these things had a moral element. And when it came to issues of morality and immorality, that's kind of what the culture had designated to the womanly arena. Now, what's fascinating about the emergence of a specific women's rights movement is that it actually begins with other reform movements. So, a lot of women had participated in various reforms, right? Temperance, trying to get people to stop drinking, the abolition of slavery, prison reform, and education. So the rise of the public woman occurred in kind of all of these other various reform movements first. But it was the experience that women had in these reform movements that made them kind of create a new priority. And that is, they came to the movement of women's rights. And we have a few examples of kind of exactly how that formed. So, one kind of important thing that we could take note of is that the women's rights movement, the advocating for rights of women in American society, was an outgrowth of a lot of these earlier movements. So, for example, some pioneers of the women's rights movement, like Sarah and Angelina Grimke, Lucretia Mott, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they had sort of similar experiences. So, for example, Sarah and Angelina Grimke, they would give speeches about anti slavery. So, these were two women that spoke publicly about anti-slavery, trying to spread the message about how slavery was evil. They were abolitionists, but oftentimes when they were up on stage, they were harassed for being women. When they would try to talk about these issues, they'd be harassed, they'd be heckled, and they found that more often than not, instead of actually talking about issues that were important like anti-slavery, they spent most of these speeches, or at least a part of it, trying to explain to the crowd and to other people that, look, they should be taken seriously as women. And so they said, well, rather than kind of prioritizing the issue of anti-slavery, they came to say, look, we can't even advocate the evils of slavery until we change kind of the way that women are perceived. And so they came to the cause of women's rights through their anti-slavery or abolitionist activism. And that sort of story is very similar. A very similar story happened to Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, another two pioneers of the women's rights movement. They were abolitionists, and they were going to attend the the World Anti-Slavery Convention. This was held in London. This was a meeting of the world's essentially abolitionists. And Lucretia Mott and Stanton, being abolitionists, went all the way to London. And when they got there, they were not let in to the World Anti-Slavery convention. And they weren't let in because they were women. And so much like Sarah and Angelina Grimke, they said, look, we're going to kind of shift our focus to a different cause, or at least even just from a practical standpoint. If your goal is to get rid of slavery and you're unable to do that because of the discriminations and stereotypes related to gender at the time, then even women's rights as a vehicle for abolition makes logical sense. So because they were denied entry into the convention, both came to the cause of women's rights. And, hundreds, if not thousands of other women were having the very same experience of kind of facing this type of gender discrimination within their other various reform movements. And so in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848, now this is often cited as the first convention on women's rights, but I'm sure you can probably find earlier ones. But what the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, when you had a lot of women who had faced the same types of kind of pressures and behaviors they did in other reform movements, they all came together at Seneca Falls and held a convention specifically on women's rights. This was not going to be about temperance, not going to be about abolition, but specifically on the issue of gender. And even though you might be able to find maybe like earlier conventions than this, I'm sure you could. This is largely considered to be the start of the women's rights movement. Right? If you had to say, when did the movement for women's rights start? You would say Seneca Falls, New York, 1848. And at that convention, they discussed kind of all the ways in which women were discriminated in American society. They drafted a document called the Declaration of Sentiments. This was a document that was modeled after the Declaration of Independence. So it was very much kind of similar to what Thomas Jefferson had wrote about in 1776. And so remember in that document, it was essentially, the colonists and the British king. And the document, we remember the Declaration of Independence mostly for the preamble, right? All men are created equal. But most of the Declaration of Independence is actually just a list of all the crimes and kind of egregious actions that the king and the empire had done against the colonists. And so what the Declaration of Sentiments did was they replaced colonists with women, and they replaced the king and the empire with men. And the document outlined all of the ways in which men had oppressed women instead of the British Empire oppressing the colonists. And of all the things that were discussed at the Seneca Falls Convention, probably the most important, maybe consensus that came out of that convention was to define what women's rights meant, right? What did women's rights mean? What did equality mean? And there were a lot of different ways in which women had been discriminated at that time. But at Seneca Falls, they made kind of one very important goal, and that was the demand for suffrage. So when we think about, various movements for women's rights in American history, oftentimes this one is the first movement, and the first movement is most closely associated with the right to vote. In other words, members at Seneca Falls said, look, the measure of women's equality is when women have the right to vote in the same way that men do.